Thank you. The subject today has minimal relationship in some ways to resistance, except that intelligence as a whole obviously clearly ties in all together. So one of the much underplayed aspects of intelligence is the intelligence that was gathered by the resistance, by the Gaullists, BCRA, and by the Communists and Maquis and other organisations, other circuits run by F section of SOE. And in fact, in another incarnation as a publisher, I'm currently involved in a project which will first of all republish Maurice Buckmaster's They Fought Alone, and also then Richard Heslop's memoirs, Heslop being the leader of the marksman circuit. And really the marksman circuit was one of those circuits that produced an awful lot of intelligence around the D-Day time. So it's a very important area, feeds into the whole intelligence. That bit is underrated. My bit today, although I will touch on other aspects of intelligence, but my bit today is solely about Bletchley Park and what Bletchley Park did. Now, the intelligence collected by the British code breakers ahead of D-Day and the invasion of Europe provided an extraordinarily comprehensive picture of the German defences, the Atlantic Wall, and their preparation. One of the most important pieces of intelligence came in late 1943 from the intercepted communications of this man, the Japanese guy you see second from right, Oshima Hiroshi, the Japanese ambassador to Berlin, who is touring the Atlantic Wall here. And he toured the German fortification along the whole of the French coast and Belgium. And that was in October 1943, and he provided a detailed rundown of the German forces in both France and Belgium. In a report deciphered and translated at Bletchley, Oshima sent his bosses in Tokyo the number of divisions with their locations and subordination. He reported the proposed reinforcements ahead of the expected invasion, which included 3 SS Panzer divisions, provided the full strength of German forces in France, which was 1.4 million men, critically noted that the narrowest point of the channel along the Pas-de-Calais and towards the Belgian border was given first place in the German army's fortification scheme, and troops dispositions, Normandy and Brittany coming next in importance. The gaps in Oshima's report, and there had seemed at the time to be very, very few, were more than filled in by Colonel Ito Saichi, the Japanese military attaché, who made his own walk along the Atlantic Wall, sending a massive 32-part report back to Tokyo. It gave a comprehensive account of every building in the fortification and every installation, detailing everything from the heaviest artillery battery to the smallest collection of flamethrowers. The Japanese military attaché cipher had been broken by this man, John Tiltman, in 1942. Tiltman, one of the leading code breakers at Bletchley, if not the greatest ever code breaker Britain has ever seen, given his work during the 1930s against the Bolsheviks, and then into the 50s, 60s and 70s against Soviet codes and ciphers. He'd also played an important role in attaining one of the most valuable and impressive pieces of intelligence in the lead up to D-Day. It was Tiltman who in late 1941 made the first break into the new German enciphered teleprinter cipher system. Now we know all about Enigma. Enigma is the thing that Bletchley is famous for. This system, the Laurens SZ40, is a much more complex cipher, machine cipher, a much more difficult machine cipher to break. This was probably the best cipher they broke at Bletchley. It was broken initially by Tiltman And he broke into it and did a classic code-breaking job on it. And then Bill Tutt and others, members of Tiltman's research section, reconstructed the internal mechanism of the teleprinter cipher. And that's typical the way that Tiltman would work. He would do, that hard entry bit, getting in there, and then leave others to get on with it and do the heavy lifting, if you like. Perhaps less glamorous, but nevertheless the important part of the code breaking. The breaking of the fish ciphers, they were codenamed fish ciphers, the teleprinter ciphers, was assisted from very early on by the creation of Colossus, the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. Colossus was the brainchild not of Alan Turing, as most people understandably assume, but of his Cambridge tutor, Max Newman, who realized that part of the deciphering process could be carried out by what Tiltman had described as a universal computing machine. And the post office engineer, Tommy Flowers, who actually built it, and his work on Colossus actually pioneered the use of valves in digital electronics. In March 1944, Bletchley broke into the enciphered teleprinter link between the High Command in Berlin and Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief in the West. Bletchley codenamed this link Jellyfish. This allowed the British codebreakers to read all of von Rundstedt's high-grade communications with Hitler. These included a series of assessments von Rundstedt. I ought to have put him up there. He's there with Rommel, who obviously you'll know was von Rundstedt's forward commander in France. The stuff that was broken on the communications with Hitler included a series of assessments from von Rundstedt, which refined details of the German defences and the strengths and capabilities of the German forces. The Jellyfish link also provided the complete order battle of the German armoured divisions, drawn from the detailed itinerary of a tour of inspection by the Inspector General of German Armed Forces, General Heinz Guderian. Bletchley wasn't the only source of intelligence on the Atlantic Wall, of course. RAF photographic reconnaissance had monitored the defences along the French coastline for several years. The intelligence provided by Bletchley was far deeper in terms of operation, though, and the specific detail, of course, allowing intelligence chiefs and analysts based at RAF Medmenham, the headquarters of photo interpretation, to refine the tasking of the PR missions flown by the Mosquitoes and Spitfires based at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire. MI6 also contributed to the intelligence picture ahead of D-Day. The various French agent networks, some controlled through the BCRA, some through the Poles, and some, like the large alliance network, directly by MI6, providing extensive details of German military activity. One of the BCR agents, and the BCRA, for those who don't know, was the Gaullist Intelligence Service. One of the BCR agents, Colonel Gilbert Renaud, a work name Monsieur Remy, stole a 10-foot-long blueprint of the Normandy stretch of the Atlantic Wall from the wall of the German headquarters in Cannes and ferried it back to Britain. MI6 agents also provided detailed sketches of the beaches where the landings were to take place. Other members of the Free French Forces were part of Operation Sussex, a joint enterprise with the BCRA and the OSS, in which 2 or 3 person teams, including female agents, were trained by MI6 before being dropped into Normandy to provide up-to-date tactical intelligence. A total of 20 teams were sent in to provide detailed intelligence on 50 separate targets in the area that the Allied forces were going to attack. Ahead of the landings themselves, Special Forces pilotage parties carried out reconnaissance of the Normandy beaches, getting close inshore on board mini-submarines. The role of SOE and the French resistance, I've said before it's often underplayed. And of course, we should also not forget MI19, who had all the captured German officers and were using them to gather intelligence, either straightforward in interviews, debriefings or interrogation, and also in secret recordings of their conversations in their cells or in the rooms where they were educating them, or where they were actually just relaxing. None of this could have the same impact, though, as the detailed teleprinter exchanges between Hitler and von Rundstedt and Rommel, or indeed the briefings that Oshima and other Japanese officials sent back to Tokyo. In early May 1944, so a few weeks from D-Day, the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin made his own tour of the German defences. His messages back to Tokyo were encrypted using the Coral cipher machine, which had just been broken in a joint Anglo-American attack. The naval attaché's report was read at Bletchley. It was more authoritative than that of Oshima, whose pro-German prejudices tended to distort and left him accepting unquestionably what he was told. The naval attaché had a long conversation with Rommel about his intentions. Rommel intended to destroy the enemy near the coast, most of all on the beaches, without allowing them to penetrate any considerable distance inland. As defence against airborne operations, he planned to cut communications between seaborne and airborne troops and to destroy them individually. And that is a quote from the Japanese naval attaché who's taken down his notes in this conversation with Rommel. So you're not just getting, where that tiny batch of flamethrowers is, you're getting Rommel's intentions. This is intelligence of the highest order. You really can't get this sort of intelligence from a human agent, because you really can't trust a human agent in the way that you can this guy's reports back to Tokyo. They're as accurate as they can be. But ultimately, the most important piece of work carried out by Bletchley Park ahead of D-Day may well have come 2.5 years earlier. From the start of the war, this is a wonderful story, but I'm going to tell it again, even if you heard it before. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear it again. From the start of the war, British intelligence had captured every spy sent into Britain by the German Secret Service, the Abwehr, and had been using them to feed false information to their German controllers. But the problem for the British officers running the double-cross system, as it was called, was that they could not be certain, they could not be sure that the Germans believed these false reports. Messages between the Abwehr agent runners and Germany were enciphered on a highly complex Enigma cipher machine. Now, obviously, the messages from the agents themselves, which MI5 is controlling in London, they know what they're saying, but that's all done on hand ciphers, and it's going largely to Madrid or Lisbon or possibly Belgrade. And that they're getting responses back on those hand ciphers. So those messages, they understand. But what they're not getting is the message between Madrid and Berlin, the message between Lisbon and Berlin, the message between Belgrade and Berlin. They don't know what is being actually said by the people in Berlin to the Abwehr controllers on the ground in these foreign capitals. And it might be, right, we're going to keep the British happy, we're going to pretend we like all this. Actually, we know it's all rubbish. And somehow we're going to work around this and play their deception back at them. So you don't know. So this is the famous Enigma machine. Now you can see there that it has a what looks like a typewriter face. Just below it, and we'll get a clearer picture in a minute, just below it there is a plug board. Just above the wooden front of it, you can just see the top of the plug board. Behind the keyboard is
a series of letters. They are lights. And then up the top there, you can just see 3 serrated edges with 3 little windows beside them. They're the rotors. That's the main mechanism of the Enigma machine. And they change the cipher every time a letter is enciphered. The cipher itself internally changes. And what happens is this. You press on the keyboard the letter you want to encipher. It goes through the system, sends an electric current through the system. It hits the first rotor and turns that rotor. It then goes through the second rotor and the third rotor. And a light comes up on the letter that is the enciphered letter. Now, when it turns that rotor round, that rotor will go round a certain number of times. It might go round, we're talking about the alphabet, so it might go round 13 times, for example. It goes around 13 times, and then the second rotor goes round once. And then the first rotor goes around another 13 times, and the second rotor goes round a second time. And eventually that second rotor will itself have gone round 13 times, and the third rotor goes round once. Now the great flaw in the Enigma machine was that if I pumped in T into the keyboard, the one letter that would never come up was T. And this was a key way of getting into the system, and that's how, essentially, at the beginning of the thing, they managed to break it. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about that. Look, there you have it. You can see it a bit closer, and it's a bit clearer. And the keyboard is, the plug board is clearer at the front there. And essentially what you're doing is plugging across various letters. So if W, for instance, came up, you would plug it across to V, and instead of W supposedly coming up there, V would come up there. That wasn't actually as great a deal as the Germans thought it might be. It was really a fairly simple way to get round that. Right, that's how it worked. Now the Abwehr machine was completely different to this because it had 4 wheels, and the times it turned round on the rotors were completely different. It was unpredictable, entirely unpredictable. It wasn't so much that it was random, it was just completely unpredictable. And so if the first rotor went round, on occasions 2 of the other rotors would go round. 3 rotors would go round at the same time. On occasions 2 rotors would go round at the same time. And the first rotor might go round 2 times, and then the second rotor would jump forward, and then the third rotor might jump forward. So it was like that. It was very, very unpredictable compared to the standard Enigma, and therefore a very, very difficult problem. And Hut 6, the branch at Bletchley, the hut, one of the famous huts, but Hut 6, which has actually been reconstructed. I do urge you to go up to Bletchley. It's just completely been radically changed up there, and it looks wonderful. Hut 6 couldn't break it, but this man, Dilly Knox on the left there, he led the British work on breaking Enigma, and he was convinced he could break it. And on 8th of December 1941, assisted by the female code-breakers, Margaret Rock on the right there, and Mavis Beatty in the middle, he succeeded. And from that point onwards, the double-cross controllers, the people running the double-cross system, working out what they should say to the Germans, what these double agents should tell the Germans, all of these people know that the Germans absolutely believe everything these double-cross agents are saying. That means that they can work up a plan to provide a cover story for D-Day. The double-cross deception, codenamed Fortitude South, evolved rapidly during the early months of 1944, but the bare bones of the plan remained the same. The Allies would make the Germans think they were going to attack the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. And then you have to wonder all these forces coming to Normandy, how do you then keep the Germans believing actually the main force is going to come to the Pas de Calais? And you use your double agents in very, very clever ways to do that. The Germans would be led to believe Normandy landings were a feint attack aimed at drawing the German forces away from the main thrust of the Allied invasion on the Pas de Calais. This would ensure that large numbers of German forces would be held back from the Normandy beaches, allowing the Allies time to establish a strong foothold. Remember Rommel's determination to keep the Allies right down on the beaches, not let them establish a foothold. That's with so many troops deployed around the Pas de Calais, as the Germans would have to have had, that would have allowed the Allies to get a foothold on the Normandy beaches. A foothold, obviously, from which they can break out towards Paris and then on to the German border. So they created a completely mythical formation, the first United States Army group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General Patton, a hero of the invasion of Sicily, and a man whom the Germans would believe must be heavily involved in the invasion of Europe, as indeed he later was. FUSAG was supposedly grouped in East Anglia and southeastern England, and it was vital that all of the agent reports, all of these double-cross agent reports, were coordinated to show that this was the case, to indicate that that's where the main thrust is coming, the Pas de Calais, and to downplay the mass of troops waiting in the south and the southwest to attack the German defences. And you can do this because you control all the German agents. So you can have them say, no, there's nothing down in the south and southwest, it's all in East Anglia and Kent. The most spectacular use of the wireless agents deployed in the Fortitude South deception plan was the Spaniard Juan García Pujol, codenamed Garbo. He was an accomplished fraudster who had originally offered his services to MI6 in Madrid and was rejected as an obvious charlatan. Undaunted, he offered his services to the German Abwehr and agreed to go to England as a German spy. He then went not to England, but to Lisbon, where, equipped with an out-of-date copy of Jane's fighting ships and a French blue guide to Britain, he began feeding false intelligence to the Germans in return for cash. He was discovered by the British, who intercepted his communications and got worried that he might discredit their own operation. So they brought him to the UK and began running him back to the Germans under British control. Garbo's network of agents, all of them completely fictitious, was so large and had become so vital to the overall deception picture that virtually everything had to be closely coordinated on a day-to-day basis. The most important of the other agents who came up in the parlance of the double-cross committee, came up for D-Day, was the triple agent Roman Chmielewski, Polish, codenamed Brutus. He'd led the Inter-Allies resistance network, the Polish network in France, and once it was discovered, volunteered to work for the Abwehr in London in order to save the other members of his group from execution. On arrival in Britain, he immediately went to the authorities and told them what had happened and was turned back against the Germans. And there are two others who need to be mentioned. One of them, the Yugoslav womanizer, Dusko Popov, codenamed Tricycle, and the other one, perhaps the most difficult of them all, the woman down there in the left, Natalia Lily Sergeyev, French citizen born in Russia, whose family had fled to Paris in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. These four were the main agents used to build up Fortitude South, the false picture of the intended target of D-Day. Tricycle and Brutus, who was supposedly a member of the Polish unit attached to FUSAG, produced an order of battle for the fictitious formation that was so precise that the Germans were supplied with details of individual units, their strengths, their locations, and were even given reproductions of the insignia that these units had on the side of their vehicles. Treasurer's role was to report from the West Country that there were very few troops there, further pushing the Germans towards the view that the main thrust of the attack is going to be in the Pas de Calais. She came close, however, to blowing the whole plan. Sent to Lisbon to collect a radio set from her Abwehr controller, she told a former acquaintance she met in the street. She told him in the street that she was working for the British Secret Service. When she returned to London, she confessed to considering mourning the Abwehr as a retribution for the British refusal to allow her to bring her pet dog to Britain without going through quarantine. She was swiftly retired and replaced by an MI5 operator who was imitating her distinctive method of sending Morse and her loquacious messages. For several days after D-Day, the Treasure character was kept active for no other reason than that her messages were so long-winded that Bletchley Park was able to follow them through the Abwehr communications and network and use them as cribs, as known plain text that they could work out the ciphers with. But by far the most important and complex role was played by this man, Garbo. At one point, he had a network of 27 supposed agents, some of whom still survived from his freelance period before the British recruited them. They included a Swiss businessman based in Bootle who reported drunken orgies and slack morales in amusement centres in Liverpool, and an enthusiastic Venezuelan living in Glasgow who had noted the willingness of Clydeside dockers to do anything for a litre of wine. The Swiss businessman died of cancer in the autumn of 1942, but his widow continued working for Garbo, becoming virtually his personal assistant. The Venezuelan also grew in stature, becoming Garbo's official deputy and developing his own ring of agents in Scotland, one of whom was an ardent communist who actually believed he was working for the Soviet Union. The Abwehr codenamed this group of agents the Benedict Network. Garbo's mistress, a secretary working in the offices of the War Cabinet, provided useful opportunities for valuable pillow talk. She, like the wireless operator, believed her lover was a Spanish Republican. Garbo had also successfully set up a large network of agents in Wales, mostly Welsh nationalists, but led by an ex-seaman who was, according to Garbo, a thoroughly undesirable character working for purely mercenary reasons. At this point, it's probably worth reminding even those familiar with the story that not one single person in this network actually existed. Nevertheless, they all contributed to the Germans' absolute belief in Garbo as their most reliable source for intelligence on the Allied plans and set the scene for his key role in Fortitude. The German belief in the existence of FUSAG was steadily built up by a number of means apart from false reports from the double agents. Dummy invasion craft nicknamed Bib Bobs were left out in the open in East Coast ports, and mobile wireless vehicles travelled round southeast England broadcasting messages from a number of different locations to fool the German radio interception units. So fantastic was Garbo's story that it would have been virtually impossible to imagine that the Germans would believe anything he said if Bletchley had not been able to read those Abwehr Enigma messages, confirming that the Germans believed virtually everything he said. This wasn't just because Garbo's story fitted perfectly with all the other details being sent by Brutus, Tricycle Treasure, and the other double agents involved. It was also because it fitted in completely with what the Germans were expecting. And that was known in detail as a result of the intercepts of messages between von Rundstedt and Hitler, Rommel and Hitler, and between Oshima and his colleagues and their government in Tokyo. All of these messages deciphered at Bletchley were vital to the way in which D-Day deception was developed and nurtured to ensure its success. Throughout April and into May, the intelligence from the Japanese diplomats in Berlin and the jellyfish link, the telephoned in cipher link, remember, between von Rundstedt and Berlin reaffirmed that the Germans believed the main British attack would be on the Pas de Calais, although there were also occasional worrying suggestions of an additional attack on Normandy. Concern over the continued German mentions of Normandy led on the 18th of May for the Allied planners to decide they would go all out on the Fortitude South deception, pointing to the main Allied landing being on the Pas de Calais. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Garbo made repeated attempts to warn his Abwehr controller that the Allied forces were on their way to Normandy. This move was agreed by Allied commanders. They realised, obviously, it was a security issue, but it would be too late for the Germans to do anything about it, and would ensure that they still believed in Garbo as their best informed secret agent after the invasion had begun. As predicted, it only served to increase their trust in him and pave the way for the next stage of the deception. Shortly after midnight on 9th of June, as the Allied advance faltered, and with the elite 1st SS Panzer Division and another armoured division on its way from on its way north from the Seine rather than Pas de Calais, together to reinforce the German defences in Normandy, Garbo sends his most important message about the D-Day landings. 3 of his agents are reporting troops massed across East Anglia and Kent, and large numbers of troops and tank transporters getting ready in eastern ports. The Normandy landings, a diversionary attack, he says the main attack is about to start and is going to come on the Pas de Calais. Garbo's warning went straight to Hitler, who ordered the 2 divisions back to the Pas de Calais to defend against what he expected to be the main invasion thrust, and awarded Garbo the Iron Cross. Had the 2 divisions continued to Normandy, the Allies might well have struggled to get that foothold, to stay there and not be thrown back into the sea. On June 11th, Bletchley Park deciphered a message from Berlin to Garbo's controller in Madrid, saying that Garbo's reports have been confirmed almost without exception and are to be described as especially valuable. The main line of investigation in future is to be the enemy group of forces southeastern and eastern England. Only the messages deciphered from the Abwehr Enigma could have provided Allied commanders with that sort of level of assurance that this deception is working. The importance of the Abwehr Enigma and the jellyfish link in confirming the D-Day deception can't be overstated. Brigadier Bill Williams, not a great picture, I'm afraid, but that's the best one of him in uniform. Brigadier Bill Williams, who was Montgomery's intelligence officer during the invasion of Europe, said that no army ever went to war better informed about the enemy. Intelligence officers at Bletchley were briefed before D-Day, and thereafter we made it our business in Normandy to send a daily intelligence summary saying what we thought was happening in front of us, and in general attempting in a friendly and unofficial fashion to keep the park aware of what we were trying to do. The whole series of signals was conversational. One thought one was talking to friends, and from that point of feeling of gratitude, which we hoped was reflected in the casually worded terms sent to the park, emerged, at least from the point of view of one consumer, i.e. him, a belief that because of them he was getting a better service. The people at the other end knew what he wanted, and there seemed to be no hesitation in the answer. The staff branch responsible for deception and cover plans was more dependent on Ultra, the Bletchley Park messages, than any of us. It was the only source revealing the enemy's reaction to a cover plan. Without Ultra, we should never have known. In the case of Fortitude South, the Pas de Calais cover plan, it is arguable that without Ultra confirmation that it was selling, it might have been dropped. Now, it's not just the fish teleprinter links and the Abwehr Enigma, which is providing intelligence, of course. Enigma generally was providing lots of intelligence. One report sent out by Bletchley had shown that enemy dispositions in the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy had changed. US paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne had been due to drop into the area to the west of the peninsula, but a Bletchley decrypt showed in late May that several German divisions had moved into the area and that any landing there would have had dreadful consequences. The resultant change saved as many as 15,000 lives. the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, the first of 28 British and American Special Liaison Unit set up to pass the ultra-intelligence on to Allied commanders were reporting through their own special communications units that their positions were secure and they were ready to receive and pass on the reports from Bletchley. Don Bussey, one of the American intelligence reporters working at Bletchley, was sent to act as head of a special liaison unit with a US military command. Good idea to send American, I think, to the Americans. They wouldn't necessarily believe what a Brit had to say. Every Allied commander had one of these special liaison units to pass on the ultra-intelligence and provide the context of those messages. Bletchley's intelligence reports were enciphered using one-time pad or the Typex, British Typex machine cipher, and sent to a special communications section unit run by Section 8 of MI6, and they sat alongside these special liaison units. This is Bussey talking now. It's very important to realise that day in, day out, the most important thing that Ultra had to tell us was the complete German order of battle. We would know their divisions by number, we would know where they were, we would know their subordinations by corps and army and by army group. We'd know the boundaries between division and between other units. And all of this gave us the kind of information which is absolutely indispensable. I would process all this information and pass it on to the people at headquarters who were authorised to receive it. The mobile Y service units, this is army, small army units actually operating the field and intercepting German messages and analysing and reporting them in a very speedy fashion. They also produced large amounts of information on the German reaction to D-Day. In conjunction with Bletchley Park, they produced the position of one of the most important German headquarters, Panzergruppe West, the headquarters of all the armoured forces in the invasion area, and Montgomery's 21st Army Group bombarded that headquarters for 3 weeks, killing most of the senior officers. There were gaps, though, in the information provided by Bletchley. The code-breakers were unable to provide a precise location for the 32nd Panzer Division, which was defending the British objective of Caen, and held up Montgomery's advance for more than a month. They also missed the presence of a German infantry division defending Omaha Beach, but these were the only blank spaces in an otherwise complete and detailed picture of the German order of battle. As the Allied forces poured into Normandy, they were held back by heavy German resistance, as you'd expect, orchestrated by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. But at the beginning of August, the 12th Army Group, the American 12th Army Group under Omar Bradley, swept south through Avranches, turned west into Brittany and eastwards towards the German tanks. This is one of the American code-breakers again, working at Bletchley. I remember after the invasion, there was a long period of time when Montgomery's forces and the US forces under General Bradley were being built up. Units were being ferried across the channel, and after they captured the initial bridgeheads, they were pinned down for quite a long period of time while this build-up was taking place. I remember a particular night when I was working on a message and some German unit reported that the American tank spearheads were in the outskirts of Rennes. I told the army advisor who was on duty at the time, and we dashed for a map to find out where Rennes was. We were astonished to find it was almost all the way across the Brittany Peninsula, and that is German troops arriving in Rennes. I like the little name of I think it looks like a mobile either anti-tank or anti-aircraft vehicle, but Hitler's has, yeah. Convinced of his own infallibility as a military strategist, Hitler now decided that von Kluge's 5th and 7th armies should force their way through to the western Normandy coast at Avranches, cutting the American thrust in half. "We must strike like lightning," Hitler told his chiefs of staff. "When we reach the sea, the American spearheads will be cut off. We might even be able to cut off their entire beachhead. We must not get bogged down in cutting off the Americans who have broken through. Their turn will come later. We must wheel north like lightning and turn the entire enemy front from the rear." There was a certain element of reason in the idea, but with more than 1 million Allied troops now firmly established in Normandy, von Kluge had little hope of carrying it out, and far worse, with Montgomery's 21st Army Group pressing down on him from the north. And you can see him in that little red bulge there. That's where von Kluge's forces are going into. With Montgomery's 21st Army Group pressing down on him from the north and the Americans sweeping westwards along his southern flank, up underneath him, he risked becoming trapped in an Allied pincer movement. The Allies, fully informed by Bletchley Park of the German plans, ensured the initiative failed, as von Kluge's counterattack faltered with its only retreat through the small gap south of the town of Falaise. Hitler insisted that it should be carried through to the bitter end. On its success depends the fate of the Battle of France, Hitler said in a message sent in the early hours of 10th of August and deciphered in Hut 6 almost immediately. Objective of the attack, the siege of Avranches, to which a bold and unhesitating thrust through is to be made. John Prestwich was on duty in Hut 3, which was where Bletchley's reporting section was based, when Hitler's orders came through. I remember it, he said, my goodness, I remember it. I remember we queried it at the time. We said, it cannot be true. It seems to us inconceivable. But what made sense was that the Americans had broken out of their base in the Cotentin Peninsula, and the Germans had made what was a perfectly sensible, limited spoiling attack on the American lines of communications. Then there came through this detailed order that 4 or 5 German armoured divisions were to go hell for leather for Avranches, and this opened up the whole possibility of wiping out the cream of the German armed forces. All you had to do was to close that little gap there, the Falaise Gap, and there was this great pocket, but it was an order from Hitler. The German generals might have thought it was lunatic, and Rommel clearly did on at least one occasion, but they obeyed on the spot because they were under oath. Within a few days, it was clear that von Kluge had no hope of carrying out Hitler's orders, and fearing that at any moment the Allies would surround his forces, he ordered their withdrawal. Allied timidity allowed 300,000 German soldiers to escape from the Falaise pocket, but a further 250,000 were either killed or captured. With the Germans now in full retreat, the Allies poured out of Normandy towards the Belgian and German borders. Paris was liberated on 25th August as Montgomery's 21st Army Group raced towards Belgium, liberating Brussels on September the 3rd. I'm not going to go on to the next part of this because that's the Battle of the Bulge. It's where we got rather overconfident. But I'm very happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Testing this, yes, it's working. Thank you very much, Michael. Do we have any questions? It's useful if people use the microphone, actually, because it then can be heard on the recording that we're making of this presentation. But do we have any questions for Michael?
I'm Ingram Murray from the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I'm also a friend of Bletchley Park. I live about 5 miles away. One of the instructions given to SOE, the Maquis, was to cut communications. The purpose obviously being to force the Germans to rely on radio, which could then be picked up by the Y service, decrypted and so on. Do we have any assessment of the value of that measure
I think that's
to Bletchley Park in terms of intelligence gain?
I think this is the destruction of all the teleprinter, telephone exchanges, because Bletchley, because the Germans obviously had access to landline communications, and that's a much better, more secure way of providing intelligence, getting your communications secure. Although there was the Gaullists were in fact into the I think it was one of the French groups was actually tapping the telephone lines quite successfully. Source K was coming from that, but yes, I think that's absolute. I couldn't tell you for sure what it was, but you know, the fact that we got so much high quality intelligence as it was has to have been down to the fact that the landlines were often difficult to use, and it must have seemed to the Germans that that teleprinter link, which was radio, enciphered so heavily as it was, would be unbreakable. Which brings us back to Tiltman and then Bill Tutt and the work they did in breaking that. But again, it allows me to say that SOE and the Resistance did a wonderful job, and people like Heslop, actually. I mean, that was one of his jobs.
I feel a PhD thesis coming on.
Please go ahead. It's all right, I'll just stand here. I won't move. Okay, any other questions?
Martin.
Not so much a question, but just backing up that point.
Yes.
I've done a lot of work on the Maquis de Plainville, who operated in 44 around just before D-Day, and well before D-Day and around D-Day, southwest of Chartres, near Nogent-le-Rotrou. And in looking at their main activities, it was cutting those lines of communication, particularly an underground cable that ran from Paris through to the west and to Brittany. And that underground cable, of course, was resistant to aerial bombardment and whatever. But of course, the Maquis group in the middle of the night could go and literally dig it up and cut it and so on. And it was virtually impossible for the Germans or the Millys to protect that at all. So they were forcing the Germans, effectively, the Resistance was forcing the Germans to use the airwaves, which meant that Bletchley could then intercept.
Any other questions? I'm going to have. I have one really. I mean, in terms of the recognition that of the role that played by Bletchley Park in these preparations, has it taken a long time for that to emerge and to be acknowledged? When you've started your researches, was it working on a field that you felt was needed to be established and was not well known, or are you pulling together a series of stories that are well known separately? How do you think about the overall picture and the knowledge of that picture?
I think the actual facts about Bletchley Park have come out, and I think there's almost a backlash. Well, I mean, I saw a BBC television programme which I had to switch off about intelligence for D-Day because it was all about PR, which is important, was important, but the tasking of photo reconnaissance as we're building up towards D-Day is driven almost by what they're hearing from Bletchley Park. So you can't. What I think the individual types of intelligence, aside from SOE actually and resistance, which is often just, as I say, underplayed. The types of intelligence are all out there. Even in 1998, when I was writing Station X, and the television program was being put together, GCHQ had begun to release files, so there was an awful lot out there already then, although we learn more as we go along because more and more stuff has come out. But what hasn't really been done, and I sought to do it a bit in a small way there, is to actually take an intelligence officer's view, take the Bill Williams view, and say, okay, I've got this stuff from Bletchley Park, I've got this stuff from Medmenham, I've got this stuff from Beaconsfield, I've got this stuff from, and how do I pull it all together, and how did that get pulled all together, and what was the importance, and what came first, the chicken or the egg? And we know that with photo reconnaissance, what came first was the systematic filming of everything that was happening along the Atlantic Wall, and not just actually
right, we've got that building in the can, we can move on to this building. But actually, that building, when the tide is low, that building, when the tide is high, that building, when the tide is in the middle, and what, because that's the sort of information you need when you're going to make an amphibious landing. And the weather and stuff like this, all of this being taken into account. Then you get all the stuff coming from these Japanese guys who've gone along here and give you a far more detailed picture, and you want to go back and look again at some of those installations and try and get a better handle on what it actually looks like. Because they made several rubber copies, models of the whole wall.
And in relation to those Japanese reports, what was the purpose from the Japanese point of view in reporting in such detail on German preparations for defence?
Well, I can see the purpose from the Japanese point of view. I'm not entirely sure why the Germans thought it was a good idea to let them report back to Tokyo. But they obviously had to trust their allies, and I guess there were difficulties between all of the Axis partners, of course, but while the Germans and the Japanese were clearly the most determined to keep going with the war, it would have been, there has to be a degree of trust. It's like all of these people, you have to have a degree of trust, and some of that went through into the double cross system as well. So you have to have a degree of trust if you're going to run an agent, if you're going to have an ally.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I just wanted to, I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about, you've reconstructed that extraordinary story that the Germans fell for, and I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about the actual archives that you used and what kind of reports they were, if you were using testimony, what are you drawing on to build this picture that you've given us of how this operated?
Yeah, the first question I missed, I'm afraid. Sorry, what was the first question?
Well, what the state of the archives, the kinds of archives that you're using, are they sort of formal official reports? Yeah. Are they testimonies by the participants? Where is that story coming from?
It comes from a variety of sources. In terms of Bletchley Park, the best possible source is the National Archives at Kew. But also the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington. Most of Bletchley Park's files have been released, although for reasons that are sometimes obscure, some haven't, because they're related to code-breaking away or something, and GCHQ thinks we can't let this out, I can't imagine how traumatic Edward Snowden must have been for GCHQ, because they're scared stiff of releasing files from 1945, and yet they give a low-level CIA man and NSA man contractor the keys to the castle. I think most of those files. So when you're doing this sort of work, that's what you can rely on. It's almost like that, the double cross people working with the the Allied planners looking at that Japanese naval attaché, telling them precisely what Rommel intends to do. You can be certain, they could be certain of that. I can sit there and look at these files, and as long as you're not looking at one individual file of a moment and assuming that something much broader comes out of it, you know that that's the truth. At that moment in time, that's the truth, and you can build up around that. Now, the other great resource, of course, for Bletchley Park is the people who work there. Now, that's more problematic. You have to be much more careful with that sort of resource because it depends who they were, how far up the level they were. And I've had people come to me who were reasonably well up the level saying, that didn't happen. We have one of the things that we have, that didn't happen, and yet you know it did happen because you've got the actual file archives. So people's memories are flawed, or their knowledge in terms of Bletchley Park, where it was all need to know. Do you need to know that, or do you need to know that? You know, and you just stick in your area. For most people, they didn't have that overview. Some people did, but most people at Bletchley didn't have an overview. And so they develop ideas. They're actually wrong, and those ideas get reinforced over the years. So you have to be very careful when you're talking to people like that. But one example is that over the years, it's been absolutely certain, with absolute certainty, and in fact, I didn't actually produce that film because I'm going to rubbish it now. The Station X television program, I didn't actually produce, I wrote the book for it. But at the end of it, there's this lovely scene of all the Colossus computers being destroyed and everything. And that's just not the case. All of the bombs were dismantled and destroyed. Oh, dismantled into small parts and recycled. And the bombs were a special sort of machine, which electromechanical machine, which helped to break Enigma. But the Colossus computers weren't all destroyed. Most of them were taken to pieces, but 4 were left intact. And 2 went to GCHQ. And our belief has always been that only 2 were left intact. But actually, 2 went to GCHQ, and 2 went to Manchester University, where they were working on what became known as a baby, first British computer with memory. So Colossus went in. We'd always believed it had been disgraceful that they'd hidden this thing away and they'd not allowed it to be used for the development of the computer. But files just recently released into the Public Record Office, and you know, not really, no one's made a big play of it, show that 2 of them went to Manchester and they were used there. So our knowledge is developing, and the thing you can trust is the stuff that's going into the American archives from NSA or the UK archives from GCHQ. And you can use, where it fits, the story of those people who carried out the work at Bletchley. And of course, they are experts in how they carried out what they did. They're not experts in the whole thing. So, you know, everyone, we had a woman come to us recently at Bletchley, and a friend of mine who does the recordings, because he's a professional sound engineer, he was talking to her, and she said, well, I wasn't really anyone that worked at Bletchley Park. I was just here operating a teleprinter. And he said, well, you were operating a teleprinter, you were sending out the intelligence reports. Why do you think you didn't work at Bletchley Park? You know, and so everyone's got a story to tell, and they can feed into that.
I'd just like to ask, how was Garbo rewarded?
Garbo went on, we think, to work for MI6 in Venezuela. He moved to Venezuela. And Nigel West, the spy writer, tracked him down in the 70s, I think, and said to him, I'd like to hear your memories. I'd like to have a book that told this story, which you can co-author. So Garbo gets very excited, you know. He's going to co-author this book. And it's all set up. Nigel West puts the book together. Garbo, Juan Pujol Garcia, Pujol, I can't remember, has written his book with Nigel West. And it's about to be published, and it's published in the UK. And just before it's published in the UK, Nigel rings up Garbo and says, wonderful news, we've sold the Spanish rights. And Garbo says, what? You can't. What do you mean you can't? Surely, you know, it's more money. You'll be a Spanish hero. You're their only World War II hero. You know, you're the only person that they can say,
did something during World War II. And he says, yes, but if it's published in Spain, my first wife will find out that I'm not dead. MI6 had sent someone round to Garbo's wife at the end of the war to say, very, very sorry, but he didn't survive. He's then gone off to Venezuela, where he's married another wife. So both wives will then discover that there is another Mrs. Garbo out there, and he doesn't want this to happen. I've no idea how this was resolved, but the Spanish rights were sold.
Any other questions?
Thank you. David Harris, with an interest in the SOE F section. As you're aware, the Germans are very clever at playing back radios from France and, of course, Holland. And it surprises me that they didn't have the equivalent of a Bletchley Park in Germany, reading our messages. Have you any knowledge of that side of things?
Low-level codes and ciphers were broken by the Germans. Virtually all of the Royal Navy's codes and ciphers early on were broken by the Germans. They were very successful in that. They were more successful actually in high-grade ciphers. They didn't break Typex, which was the one that we used most of the war. We went over to Typex almost exclusively for high-grade messages, and of course one-time pads, which you can break if they're badly used, as the Russians did with the Venona project. But you can't generally break. We eventually managed to construct a Royal Naval code that they couldn't break. And that was actually Tiltman who put that code together, so early on. And this is something that Bletchley has to take responsibility for, because the security of British codes and ciphers actually fell to Bletchley Park, to the Government Code and Cipher School, though it was a section of Code and Cipher School that operated from Oxford during the war rather than from Bletchley. And around 1941, early 1941, Tiltman takes this over and makes sure that everything is done properly. And from that point onwards, the Germans are having difficulty breaking into anything of ours, of a high level. Obviously, operational codes and ciphers have to be much more easy to break. They're double player or something like that. It's fairly easy to break. But they were very, very successful at deciphering the Russian teleprinter ciphers, which were very, very clever. They sort of preceded the mass communications move forward that the Japanese and British to a certain extent and the Americans pushed forward after the war. The Russian cipher machine would break up the message into different bits. Each would be sent on a different frequency, so there were 8 frequencies working. And the Germans, when we went to Germany after the war, not me personally obviously, but when we sent missions to Germany to collect all their scientific and radio and communications intelligence, we found that they had this extraordinary ability to refuse the 8 different frequencies and find out how it worked.
This will probably be the last question. Let's Sally.
I wondered, could you just give us your comments on why John Tiltman hasn't had the recognition he perhaps deserves?
Sorry?
Why John Tiltman hasn't had the recognition
John
amongst the
Tiltman
general
hasn't
public?
had recognition because he's not got the romance of Turing, or indeed of Dilly Knox, who more recently has had a bit of recognition with the publication by Mavis Beatty, whose photo you saw of a biography of the late Mavis Beatty, sadly, of a biography of her boss. Tiltman's work started off in 1920 worked 1919 actually, working with the British Army's code-breaking unit. And then 1919 they amalgamate the British Army and Navy code-breaking units to form the Government Code and Cipher School, which is Bletchley, the thing that actually moves to Bletchley Park at the start of the war. And through the 20s and 30s, he worked both here in the UK and actually in northern India and in Iraq on Soviet ciphers and Soviet codes and ciphers, and broke all of the main Soviet codes and ciphers. So he was an expert on Soviet codes and ciphers. He then became, because he was just a good code breaker, he's doing Japanese codes and ciphers. Broke the main Japanese codes and ciphers before the Americans did. The Americans, after the war, got the recognition for breaking all the Japanese codes and ciphers. Most of the break-ins, that difficult part at the start, was done by the Brits. That's not me bullshitting. I mean, that's true. And the Americans were very much better at keeping going with it, because you have to break a cipher every day because the keys change. And the Americans were much more imaginative in their willingness to use things like holograph, calculating, computer process. They weren't computers, but they were processing machines which processed data. And they used those and threw money at it and were able to keep on top of it in a way that Brits weren't always able to do. Tiltman, after the war, and this is the key to the thing, continued working for the British. And then in 1948, he's one of the leading guys breaking Soviet ciphers at this stage. 1948, there was an American called William Weissman who was working for the Russians and gave away all the secrets about what codes and Russian codes and ciphers had been broken. And there was this black day on which everything went blank and they couldn't break into anything anymore. And Tiltman was then rushed across to America. And for the rest of his career, he worked in America, advising the Americans on how to break Russian codes and ciphers and leading the way into the ones that no one could break. When he was 60, because he was a civil servant by now, he was supposed to retire. I can't remember when that 60 was, but GCHQ said, no, you're too important to us, you can stay on. And so he stayed on till he was 70. And GCHQ said, right, you're 70, we can't keep you on even now. But the Americans, NSA, said, where do you think you're going? You're staying here. So he didn't retire until 1982, when he was well into his 80s. And amazing man. And the reason we don't know much more about him is because probably his most productive period will have been during that period. And that's still a secret. Despite Snowden.
The most disgraceful failure of recognition was Tommy Flowers, surely.
Yes, I think so. I think so, and the GPO have to take a large chunk of the responsibility of that, but GCHQ as well.
Yeah.
We gave him an honorary degree though.
Good stuff. You should have been enlightened.
Yeah. This discovery that Colossus went to Manchester, you may hasten some sort of recognition. You can't have a posthumous knighthood, can you? It doesn't happen, does it? I think. I don't know.
You have it taken away.
Yeah, you can.
This is a conversation that probably should carry on in the cafe, but I'd like to thank Michael Smith so very much for this fascinating introduction.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I've just taken it out so it won't save anything.